Now they're farming one field. They're leaving a field bare because they have 1/4 of the water pressure that they had 40 years ago. That's the mindset that we got to have with polycropping. I met a man named James Bates, and he was a plant breeder in Hawaii, and he was noticing the same thing, that plants get defensive in the heat of the summer and the heat of the afternoon. So he started putting up different ways to block the sun, and he noticed that the crops wouldn't wilt as bad in the hours of 2 to 6.
Do you think, a farm is going to be able to grow and be profitable by doing this sort of renaissance thing? Things like be
profitable the other way around, unless your grandpa has a shit ton of equity.
I'm Chris Halsworth, a grain originator and accountant living in Pocahontas, Iowa, and you are listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, Jason Mauck returns. Longtime listeners of the podcast will know I've had Jason on a couple times. The first time, became very clear that he is a mad scientist farmer. He is a guy that is pushing the envelope on what can be done. And sometimes when you hear him talk, you think, that's crazy. I do not believe that what you're saying about light and how plants grow is going to work. But I have now had the chance to both visit his farm and visit the farms of people that Jason has influenced. And I can tell you firsthand that what he is talking about is real. We're going to get to that interview in just a moment. But first, I have a request for listeners. I've been putting together these communications videos. They've been shorts on YouTube, and we've started putting them out on Instagram. And they're about how to communicate better, how to build better conversations, how to engage people that sometimes don't want to open up. And I had an idea that maybe we could get some situations from you, the listener, that can prompt me to come up with some better ways of explaining communications. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're struggling to communicate something to your mother or your dad or your spouse, or maybe you just want to get along better with the people you work with, send an email to stories@legacyinterviews.com and tell me a little bit about your challenge. If we can, we'll put them on the YouTube Reels as me trying as best I can to give you an answer about how to communicate more effectively. And if you're interested in having me sit down with your loved one to record their life stories so that future generations can know their family history, go to legacyinterviews.com to find out more. All right, without further ado, let's head to the interview with Jason Mauck. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me over.
Yeah, man, glad you could make it. So you are well known for all of your crazy farming things, and I can remember 4 years ago when we sat down, you talked about being trusting and putting ideas in people's hands, and then you took a big jump at the world. You said, hey, I want to try and put together the meat production system that the world wants. Everybody knows that they need it, but it isn't there. You've done that. It didn't work. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in hearing what you learned through that adventure.
Well, to sum it up, maybe people are a little less predictable as plants as far as ranging. Now, I had a lot of really good folks, and I wish I could keep them engaged in something, and they've moved on, and I'd really tried to give them opportunities. But to sum it up, I thought we needed to have a USDA.
Well, what were you building, first of all? What were you trying to build?
Okay, so during COVID, the store shelves were empty as far as meat. The price was through the roof. The price that the farmer was receiving for commodities was at an all-time low, especially with inflation and all that stuff. So we just called around some meat places to see if there's any opportunity. And this older gentleman, I think he's about 68 years old, raised his hand and said, yes, please come take over my business. I'm wanting to retire. A company called Muncie Meats that had been there since 1957. They're right going into downtown Muncie. And basically, a short story, he had worked there since high school. All his clients, he had, 250, 300 restaurants that he portion control meat to. So we were able to purchase the company at a very low price. I didn't think it was a very risky venture, to be honest with you, at the beginning. Come to find out, the treadmill went up in speed very quick once we figured out kind of how the game works with inspection, and every single nook and cranny and corner of our facility was now really scrutinized, as that guy was kind of grandfathered through, and the new owners, us, kind of took over with a different vision.
So you took over, and then all the rules and regulations that this guy had been able to use, whatever the older regulations were since it was being updated, now all of a sudden everybody in a government bureaucracy is coming along being like, but these are the new rules that you have to follow.
Yes.
Like what?
Well, our first thing that we had to do was grind hamburger, because we were getting all this steak and we had all this trimmings. And the company that he had been giving the trim to, they had lost someone in their family and they were going out of business. So we could no longer get like 68 cents per pound for all this trim. So at the time, the market for hamburger was $4 a pound. And we're cutting up tons of ribeyes and sirloins, and we've got this premium product that we can't do anything about. So we said, hey, we want to grind this hamburger. What do we need to do? And it was, A, B, C, or D, or all of these hoops. Well, come to find out, A would take us 2 months and $200,000. Then once we figured that out, then we had B, and it took like 15 months from when we bought the company when we could start grinding hamburger. And we spent over $1 million on a company that I bought for less than $200,000.
Like what kinds of things are they asking you to do?
So first off, every nook and cranny and corner of the thing, if it wasn't covered with aluminum, we had a freezer that didn't go up to par. We just had to just one by one revise what we did. We had to, figure out, we had to go by this HACCP plan to the T, and a lot of things weren't there. On and on and on. It was a challenge to just be able to, something that I thought would be simple, and it was killing us.
Dude, were the regulations, did they make sense?
It's for the greater safety of the public, and I get that. But the problem wasn't so much I disagreed with any of that. It was the ability for them to give a rat's ass about my company. The inspector was an alcoholic. You could smell it as soon as he came in the room. And there was just zero follow-up or care. We would get something and I would call, demanding a meeting, and it might be 6 weeks. And again, I knew that there was multiple hoops, and we're trying to, sales are going up as restaurants are coming on board. But if you can't solve the entire riddle and you have a waste in part of that stream, it's hard to become whole. And just kind of carrot is put out in front of you, like, if we can just solve this, then we'll be whole. But you just can't go rogue when you're.
This is what people that aren't like property owners or aren't running a business don't see, is that like basically every aspect of our economy is like this. I talk to people that are, buying old dilapidated apartments, and they're bringing them up and they're making them better and they're creating places for people to live. And the inspector just doesn't show up when he says he's going to. I'll be there between 10 and 2. And then like at 4:30, when you've driven across town to do something else, he calls, hey, I'm waiting for you.
Yeah.
And like, it doesn't cost him anything to miss a meeting, to cause a problem, to like, not follow through with whatever they did, but they can ding you so hard that it can wreck you. Yeah. And like, they're completely unaccountable.
Yes. To your point, it's not the same amount of rules. We're scrutinized, but they can get away with, incompetence.
And so at what level was this? This is like state? This is
USDA.
So you're dealing with the federal government.
Yes. And that's the only way that anyone can create a brand. My idea was to be a facilitator for other farms that wanted to create their brand to have distribution across the United States. And you can't do that if you're state inspected. You have to stay in your little fishbowl.
And this is to clarify, if you are just going to butcher meat and sell it in the state of Missouri, then you get a state inspector, and they say, yes, we agree that you follow all the state rules. But if you travel over to Illinois and start selling that Missouri inspected meat, now somebody's going to come arrest you because you've broken the law.
Yes.
And so then you have to get the USDA in order to be able to serve it throughout the country. But their bar for what you've got to get past is higher.
Yeah, and the reality of the situation with COVID and everything else, small business continues to dwindle down. So our customer base, yeah, we could go to Bob's Bar, but that wasn't a very big market. We needed to sell to the Chili's and Applebee's and all that stuff through distributors, Cisco and all these people. So we kind of became the packager of the steaks that went into Indianapolis and beyond in Cincinnati, Louisville, different cities. So you have to have that regulation.
Was the steaks that you were going to be producing, were they different than the people that are selling to JBS or?
Not at first. So at first we didn't have the facilities and the infrastructure. We had to buy boxed meat. But the whole reason I bought it to begin with is to empower the farmer. So we had a processing facility in mind. We started working with him that was local, about 50 miles from my house in Fairmount, Indiana. We were working through get it USDA certified as well, something that we think would take 3 months, took 18 months on that. So to fill that void and start butchering carcasses, I had a relationship with 3 or 4 different places that would kill and chill. So we would take cattle from farmers and this main farm, 10, 12, 15 per week at different places. They would harvest the animal, put it in these boxes, and then we would go get those boxes and bring it to Muncie Meats. And we had some capital during COVID to buy the packaging machines and stuff like that, but a lot of that got ate up by the USDA wanting us to renovate, the back corner with aluminum wrapping, had nothing to do with our, upping our capacity. So that gunpowder quickly was eroded, and at the time I thought that this would all work out because we were constantly progressing, getting together with people, getting new things, but it just seemed like it was never ending, the anchor I was trying to drag as far as the timeline.
And what was your dream? What did you like, if this would have fully gotten up to where you thought it could get, what would have changed about the world?
Man, the dream would be that if you live in Gaston, Indiana, or rural Illinois, and you drove by a farm, you could go to the local grocery store or go online, and it was readily available to purchase meat from that farmer. Just more of a not only transparency, but an actual tangible product that was more local.
But I mean, that is like genuinely pushing back against gravity or something, because because the centralized system, I mean, their economies of scale are so massive. While you're trying to get 12 steers brought to a production facility to kill them and then bring them over, they're producing 12 steers a minute or something crazy. They're just, truckload after truckload after truckload, and like they have enough money built into their budgets to cover all the inspections.
And they own the shelf space, pretty much.
Oh, I don't know about this.
And that's huge. Yeah, so all these bigger companies now, not only do they sell the farmer fertilizer, they own the slaughterhouse, but they also, they're in the Walmarts of the world and all that stuff, and they hold the whole power. So if one part of it doesn't work out, they can put the math in, at the end part of it.
When did it become clear to you that like this is not going to work?
Not really until I was basically out of spit, and when I started uncovering some sheets, there were some things I didn't know about. But kind of the thing that opened my eyes, we went on spring break down in North Padre Beach, Texas, and went on the West Coast, and I was driving through southwestern Texas, and there's a spot there where there's 6 railroad tracks that are parallel, and the flies would hit your window. You would just have to turn on your wipers because these feedlots are just enormous. So you would pass by this huge packing company, you would see huge feedlots, and there was just commerce going so quickly and of so much scale. And at that point, we still hadn't had a viable business. There was a few hurdles in front of us, and I'm like, I cannot outrace this machine. And part of the thought was, with kind of the footprint with social media, maybe that would help with the facilitating. I could collaborate in the pet food space and create value in the whole carcass riddle to make this work, to overcome that with the transparency and all that stuff. And we had the technology to track each carcass and all that stuff, and it was working. But it just, especially, the thing that killed us more than anything was the inflation of everything, and trying to do logistics on the road and pay for tires. And the biggest racket was the refrigeration business. If your cooler went out, you called one guy, there's no competition, and something that you think would cost a couple $100 would be $7,000. And you've got, 10 trucks on the road, and you're just constantly just getting kicked in the nuts.
So you're like an incredibly optimistic, upbeat guy as you're starting to have the blows rain down on you, and you come to the conclusion like the blows aren't going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
How did you handle this?
Well, it was pretty tough for a while. Just a pride issue. Honestly, I just kind of tried to shut up and just work. And then eventually you kind of get through it. And then you're like, this wasn't my plan. And you're fine with that, and, I don't like to give up. So that was hard, giving up, because, my dad was pretty hard on my sister one time. She was playing sports, and she's decided to be a manager on the sports team. Nothing wrong with that. But just the idea of quitting bothered me. I lost my father, so I felt like I was letting him down. I was letting the community down. But I got over it. So, and I acquired skills that I didn't know that I had. I was very assertive in board meeting situations, getting together with companies much larger than me to get what I want. I would tell them exactly what I wanted, no matter what, and really proved to a lot of people that I was worthy to get together with our company or our people to do that. So even though it didn't work out, I feel like I'm polished somewhat. I'm capable. So I don't have any big objectives right now. But I feel comfortable that once whatever it is next, I'm capable of doing something.
If you could take all the knowledge that you have now, but you were able to rewind the clock back to like the starting point,
mm-hmm.
would the outcome have been different?
Probably not.
So this is inevitable, you're saying?
There's a lot of dead roadkill on the side of the road in the meat company. You just outrun your headlights. And I that was never the objective. My grandpa always said a dog that shits fast doesn't shit long. There's a lot of truth to that. Because if there's two things to it. You lose your authenticity when you scale. The market is only so big that will appreciate something. And then once you outrun your headlights and you lose that, now you're playing ball with the big boys and you can't play that game. So I think a lot of people take that pill, and it's not a good outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think the amount of time it takes information to spread for people to like really buy into what you're doing is so much longer than you imagine. And it's probably harder if you start off with a group of people cheering for you and you're like, look, all these people get it. The circle outside of those people, they're just right behind them. All they got to do is hear about it and they're going to get on board. But in my experience, doing the legacy interviews business, when I first started, I thought like, look at all these people telling me, yes, it's awesome. They'd love it. Well, just outside of that circle, there's no cheering. There's nobody that cares at all about what you're doing. And they don't even have time to learn about what you're doing. So like my imagination always ran wild thinking that it would be.
Mm-hmm. You hit the nail on the head. You have this group of friends, and it doesn't matter what it is whether you're trying to exude some new idea or business or some group that believes in something. It's kind of the same group of people get together until they kind of get burnt out about yelling to the same people, preaching to the choir. And in the smaller town, you have your cheerleaders, and then you almost have the opposite where there's, I don't know if it's jealousy or what, but I think there's an underlying thing where people maybe don't want to see it take off. So they're just gonna say, there's a thing in the Simpsons where it's like, let's not listen.
I mean, I think like I can relate to the people that don't want to see somebody succeed, because there's sometimes when you're looking out at the world and you're being like, well, that guy's success, how does he get to be successful? And I've now like taken on the meditation. If I ever find myself rooting against somebody, then you're like, whoa, what's going on with me? Like, what's my failure? But I think it's a natural human reaction to see somebody doing something different, that's difficult, that is like reaching for something that doesn't exist right now, for you to be like, no, it can't be done. And the reason it can't be done is because I know better. And it's like this weird part of human psychology. And I think you're right. There's no way you're going to get away from having, they're not even always haters. Sometimes there are people that are really close to you that are like, I couldn't do that. I couldn't imagine a way that I could do that. So I'm going to assume,
yes,
for your sake, that you can't do it.
And I don't want to tell anybody that they can't be successful in the meat company, but you're not going to take on the big machine.
It certainly has to be some way where you are not turning what you're doing into a commodity. Because as soon as you get into the commodity game, now you are playing for what is the lowest amount of waste we can have. What is the, because it's going to take the margins all the way down to as close to zero as possible, because everybody's going to compete. So you have to be something that's not a commodity, but like to get up to scale where you can make money, like it's hard to make money as a craftsman.
And then it comes down to a gills game, if you will, like a pearl diver. If, the inflated price was so high, Cargill made hundreds of billions of dollars that they had enough retained earnings that they could literally go to the bottom of the ocean, let things go down as they have control of that, and just let people die, and that's a big luxury that you have when you're that big.
Yeah, people often ascribe, if you watch on ag Twitter, particularly the cattle markets, like they ascribe a lot of malintent by the meat companies, right? Do you think that the people running these meat companies have malintent, or is there something else going on there?
I don't know. I just think that there's just the naiveness that I had 3 or 4 or 5 years ago was I thought I would find these people, and there are people out there that want to push a better way, but a lot of these people are just screwing a corpse for money, and it's all about profit motive. So that's about all I can say about that.
Yeah, you mentioned inflation, right? So things got more expensive. You've seen that firsthand. Where do you think the world of meat goes? Does the price of meat just keep going up in our inflated world?
I think so. Yeah. I know that I don't know who the powers that be of the deep blue state is, but if you have your seed, your semen, your things, a farmer, you can kind of control your circle around you. But the bigger picture is all those prices, like for meat, are going to go up, and a lot of things like that. It's a lot cheaper to make it to fry some corn and produce Cheetos than it is to make a pound of steak. No doubt about that.
So let's talk about the current food system. What's your take on it? I mean, I know you spend a lot of time railing against it. You're also, a participant in it. Mm-hmm. First of all, tell people that don't know you very well, how do you make money now? What is your role?
So I farm. We farm about 3,100 acres between Indianapolis and Fort Wayne in Indiana. My grandpa's dad moved to my house in 1940, so we're relatively new as far as the generational. I don't know what that makes me, but we We farm corn, soybeans, wheat. We've got a bunch of pigs that we raise for Tyson. So we've kind of got a unique farm that we own a lot of the ground. Grandpa, I'm so privileged that he was all about making our farm debt-free before he passed. So we own quite a bit of ground. We have manure for fertilizer. And myself, I grew up with an imaginary friend in my belly button named Poey. And I've always relied on him when I was little, and maybe social media is my new Poey. But I think everything has a mind, including my pets, my plants. Everything is thinking, it's perceiving its environment. So when I was really young, I would steal seeds out of the grain bin, and I had like 50 fields throughout where I live today. I would plant a little piece of corn here, and I'd take some cat shit right next to it, and I'd grow plants. And, when I was going through school and graduating high school and going into college, my mom, I did pretty well in school and tests and stuff like that. And she's like, there's just no money in farming. You've got to do something else. As our family farm is fine. We were gaining wealth, but the commodities, beans were like $4 a bushel. Corn was $1 something. This is like the mid 90s.
And you were raising hogs, right? So the price could drop right out of those.
We had our own hogs at that time. And talk about the gill mentality. Pork went down to less than a dime. So all private pork pretty much died at that point. And my dad was a board member of the local feed mill. He was interested in these new pig barns that were being built. So we were one of the first farms in the state, really, to build a confined feeding operation for our farm. He wanted the manure. We built a big investment at the local feed mill to feed pigs, and that grew. We were feeding like 250,000 pigs out of the feed mill. So we've got 12,000 hogs, and that's just kind of what started that. I don't know where I was going.
So we're talking about the food system.
Yes. And so I'm different. I am, after I went to school, I got a marketing degree. I sold things. I got to meet all the matadors that were awesome at sales. I didn't like to lie to people. I didn't like to create some need to buy right now. I thought it was total bullshit. So I started knocking on doors of past customers, and that pissed off all the sales guys because I was selling their guys, but they weren't seeing these customers. And they got mad. The owner of the company loved me. He was paying all this commission. And I'm like, I'm not dealing with this shit. I'm going to start my own business because I learned how to get people on paper.
Yeah, we talked about this. Then you did landscaping, and then you found...
So I didn't want to have a suit and tie. So then I just went out and I built a $500,000 landscape business in 2 years. And my thing was I would go to a place and I would like pull a weed out of their place. I'm like, who's taking care of your place? And it was really easy to get ink on paper in the landscape business. I had a college there at Ball State. I played basketball and recruit athletes that could run a weed eater when it was hot. And we just had like a dream team of landscaping. And that was going well. I'd go on vacation all the time. And then my dad got cancer. So just at the thing, I went from kind of living kind of a playboy life in my 20s where there's tons of cash flow, good team, to dragging dead pigs out of the hog barn every morning. So that was my morning. I went from like talking to rich guys about their bass boat and what they were going to do. And I had all these customers to waking up in the morning. At the time we had like 8,000 hogs, and I was walking through the barns of the feed mill, and there would always be 3, 4, 5, 6, 15 pigs that, especially during heat waves, that I'd have to drag up and take to the compost bin. So it's just like, and then my dad just had passed. So my life just went dark and it sucked. I had some, from landscaping, like I smoked weed to, that was just what you did, in the mornings to get things ready, to where it went to like a dark place. Like my girlfriend didn't like it. So I was getting like the K9 shit from the gas stations, and that stuff would mess you up. And I'm dragging out dead pigs. I'm in a toxic relationship. And the best thing that ever happened was we had a party and she was cheating on me upstairs, and I became aware of it. I was in a hot tub and it was like this bad thing, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. And honestly, the turbulence and shit that all happened right then is what soothed me going through the shit of the meat company. Because I knew at that point, if that wouldn't have happened, I would have never cleaned myself up, became a human being worthy of meeting my wife. Because there was like a gray area there where 6 months where I hadn't improved as a person, and I intersected some people that were better than me, and I just stopped it because I'm like, I'm not gonna waste their time because I'm not worthy. So I don't know, like I look at that as very important in my life. So I met my wife. She's an amazing human being. You've met her.
She's awesome.
We have 2 fantastic kids that are great and incredible. So life is fantastic. So any venture that I have that might be a little bit audacious, I know that I get to come home to, heaven.
Yeah. And so you talked about the things that cause you to change, right? It's like hitting this kind of rock bottom or having this. Do you think people can change when they don't hit rock bottom? Do you have to have some cataclysm?
I don't know. I think you can. I don't know the reason to. Maybe you intersect someone that you're hungover that morning, and which goes back to I think there's got to be something that you don't like that you have to change. But I was telling them before, they're like, well, what do you eat for breakfast? I'm like, nothing. I like the pain of, I do intermittent fasting now. I like the hunger. It makes you sharp. I like being sober and hungry. You never think better than when you don't have anything to lose. So, it really does make people soft when they've got plenty in their bank account, some friends that do good times, and not much reason to change then.
So you've got 2 boys, and I think when you have kids, you start looking around to be like, what am I going to feed my kids? What is the right way to do things? You're a part of the food system. You're feeding kids. What do you think of the food that's available to them?
I think 99% of it's terrible for them. And I don't mean to make anyone upset, but when I'm tired of holidays, I'm tired of all these reasons to buy gourds of shit for my kids, myself. I hate having it around. But when I drive, I travel a lot and speak, and I drive, there is no options. And that was the reason why I bought Muncie Meats, is because if I go to the gas station, I can get Funyuns, I can get maybe some salami or something like that. But I was very proud that we were distributing fresh cut meat to all these places that was not an option for.
Yeah, that's where I encounter the, like, what is the food system that everybody's exposed to? Like, because in my house, like, we know what we buy at the grocery store. We stay out of the middle of it for the most part. But then when I would travel all the time, you'd be like, literally, there's nothing here to eat. Like, I can drink water, I could have beef jerky, and that's about as good as you can do, right? Like, if you ever buy a piece of fruit from a grocery store or from a rest stop, it's terrible. Like, you don't want it. Why is the system this way? Nobody wants that.
It's all about distribution and profit. Would they pick strawberries? Have you ever noticed you get a package of strawberries? If you don't eat them that day, they're just shit the next day. I mean, everything is picked before. Everything is, they call it inside the box in the pig industry, where they want pigs at 290 pounds, so it just fits in the robot. Like, everything has to fit in the little thing so we can scale it and be efficient and competitive, and there's just no room for the nuance. And quite frankly, is we've just become accustomed to the taste of seed oils, of salt. You know, a lot of people like they give grass-fed beef a bad name because it just doesn't have the fat. Well, like why? And I am very rare there. I don't really look forward to eating so much. I don't like, you know, I like grandma's home cooking. I like that kind of stuff. But, you know, we've just been so competitive in the food space that we're kind of in this world of, okay, who can make it the biggest Whopper and most things of bacon or most spices on the Cheetos. It's just always what's new, what's going to, it's where we're at.
Yeah, I think there's a reason why every religion has dietary restrictions. Mm-hmm. And I think that, like, if you go back and look at, like, either cultural, like this is the way we eat culturally, or this is the way we eat religiously, you may not agree with the religion or the culture, but there's often a lot of wisdom in it. And, like, one of the most amazing ones is when you start finding out about, like, blood glucose, for example, right? So if I eat something sweet for lunch today, an hour and a half later, I'm going to have trouble staying awake. And this is something that, like, I've had to come to the conclusion, like, I may not be clinically diabetic, but something weird is going on with my blood glucose. Well, you go and you find out, well, there are a lot of cultures where they have you eat, like, a really small salad. What's on that salad? Oil and vinegar. Well, it turns out vinegar levels out blood glucose. So one of the reasons that people were doing these little salads before you'd eat was so that way you would ingest some vinegar, and then if you ended up taking on some carbohydrates, your blood sugar wouldn't spike and you wouldn't have this, like, I'm falling asleep in the middle of the day thing. Oh. And I think that there's all sorts of religious and cultural traditions that we pushed aside. I had one time this guy on that ran a country club, but he started out as a chef and then he worked his way up to being like a really high-end chef. And he was the first person I'd ever heard say, I hate fusion cuisine. Fusion cuisine is destroying everything because you're, like, taking the best of these different types of foods, but you're forgetting, why did they build the food the way that they did? Why did they have the appetizer course the way that they did and the main course the way that they did? And he's like, all that knowledge that was hidden within the food system that we just did, we didn't always know why we were doing it, ended up having all these positive benefits for us, but we threw it out in favor of new, quick, cool, fashionable.
Mm-hmm. A lot of truth to that. We've just divided almost everything now, and everything's taken out of context, whether you're talking in political realms to, you know, I am so glad we had a primary in Indiana. I'm kind of changing subjects here, but I'm just get so sick of how people can cut and paste things to make their point, and it's just making us dumber by the day, it seems like.
So a couple of weeks ago, I saw our joint friend, Zach Smith, one of the greatest guys out there, an exceptional farmer, really very innovative guy. He posted a video of the water coming out of his, his pattern tiling. And now, I was not making a comment towards Zach. If I have a problem with something Zach's doing, I'll just call him and tell him. Yeah. But I don't have a problem with what Zach's doing. I just made the observation, look how much water is coming out of these drain tiles in the United States. So for people that aren't in agriculture, it became very, very popular for farmers to go through their fields and put in this drainage tile that made it so the water that was sitting at the top of either on the soil or ponding would go down to the drain tile and flow out, so you could get into your field maybe 2 weeks early. So that meant you got 14 more days of sunshine, which meant your crop could be much, much bigger, and you could even drain out ponding. Well, I made the observation that done on any one individual field, no big deal. Done across the continental United States, you're literally changing the watershed. Mm-hmm. And people went flipping ballistic on me, saying, like, you don't know anything. We were stopping all this erosion. I think there's probably good cases for this, right? There's positives to it. But you can't tell me that there's not major drawbacks to draining the entire continental United States early and way faster than it's ever been done before.
Yeah. So I'm going to touch on this. I'll get to it here in just 30 seconds. But let's say we had 4 minutes. Last time we were at your place, I asked you were doing jiu-jitsu. And I said, how would you kill me right now? And what'd you tell me?
I'd probably try and take your back, and
how would you take?
Probably about 4 minutes.
So what is the most important thing in existence? In that, to kill me, we got to cut off air, right? So besides air, plants need light. They need water. Water is our big factor. So the problem is we have scaled everything to dummy it down to grow one freaking crop. So as soon as the crops are off, guys are getting in their 700 horsepower tractor, they're disc ripping to get the ground black, to warm it up. They put the pattern tile in. Grandpa put it in 80 feet. We're going to put it in 40 feet. We need to split the 40s and put it in 20s because we got to warm the ground up. We got to get the water out, and then we can plant our corn. And Dave Hula, he grows 600 bushel corn. If we do that, we can get close to Dave Hula. The problem is we're so unconnected to what is happening in nature, to the water, to what grows when we don't touch it. You got the trees and the grass and the perennial shrubs and all this stuff. When it rains, then everything will grow at the same time. Look at the understory of a forest. When it's trying to photosynthesize, and depending on GDUs, late April, the understory is going to beat it to photosynthesis about 3 weeks because it knows that top canopy will win, so it needs to get its photosynthesis going ahead. It's just all perception. Everything's perception. So the problem isn't so much the drain tile in itself as if we're just looking at growing corn and beans. So we've murdered sunflowers and oats and all these crops that used to make sense when the farm had livestock. You know, they had the pasture, they plowed under the clover, they had the oats for the horses, they had 10, 15 different crops, 5 or 6 different livestock out there to make it work. We've just eradicated it all to grow as much corn as possible because industry's like, we can grind the corn up and turn it into this and this and this and this. Everything's just a bulk, industrial bulk commodities. So the idiocracy isn't in the lack of nuance in drain tile as it's bad or good. There are things that are good. If I want to grow a cereal out there and I get a bunch of precipitation in the winter, I can keep the cover crop growing in the field so I don't have ponding. So it just lowers the water table in itself. But the idea of relying on horsepower, which requires a lot of weight, which creates its own compaction, to disc rip to have a dead soil with nothing growing it, so we don't have any roots to actually take off compaction. We're just constantly itching poison ivy to maximize one crop, which in itself is the most special needs way of managing an acre of land because it only photosynthesizes. I mean, I drove here from Indiana and I got in southern Illinois, nothing growing because it's been too wet. Everyone's out there trying to disc mud right now, getting a crop in. You know, there's tons of crops that could be planted in the fall and they can grow in unison with the summer crop, and the photosynthesis and all that stuff can be nonstop. So when it rains a bunch, yes, it's good to have some tile out there, but it needs to have layers. It needs to have crops that are always growing.
Yeah, if I were going to restate for somebody that isn't really acquainted with agriculture, what you're saying is, look, we used to have all kinds of things that a farmer would grow on their fields. They wouldn't just say all 200 acres that I'm farming are going to be straight corn. And instead, he had to raise something for his horses because he was going to have to pull a wagon behind it. And he was going to have to, keep other grains out there because presumably there wasn't a market just for corn. And now what we're doing is we're maximizing for just corn, which means that all of the equipment people are buying, the structure from the way that they're even going over their fields is just focused on this one thing. And not only is that, not in tune with nature, but it also is not progressing agriculture forward in some important way.
Yes, but it makes us reliant on industry to supply us with everything. You had to grow clover because that was a legume that would create nitrogen for corn. But after the war, we had all these states. What are we going to do with all this stuff? So a lot of these things that were invented in wars, we use those resources.
Like the Haber-Bosch. So now people can go over the field and spray liquid nitrogen on their fields because we now have a way to do that. And the ag companies would say, look, the invention of liquid nitrogen is what empowered us to have billions and billions of people because we're able to do this at a scale that if you're trying to do it with just clover, you may not be able to get enough nitrogen on there.
Yes. So to back up a little bit, again, I was pretty studious. I got a marketing degree, and I don't watch TV so much for the program. I watch it for the commercials and their motive. And I've just noticed that bigger people drive really small cars. Short people have lifts on their trucks. America has created all of these holidays and everything to corral people, to create scarcity. Watch the day after Thanksgiving and people just fist fighting for the Nintendo. We've become so materialistic and corral people that we create a price elasticity, or that's not the right word, but we elevate price. But what happens July 5th to fireworks?
Yeah, the price drops.
So they were at 400% profit margin, and then they're 80% off. Hell of a deal. Christmas wrapping paper. So what has happened in agriculture is we're all growing corn. I watched, what was great was there was some corn planted, you could tell in April, and they were full of pigweed because our soil is so heavy with nitrogen on the top that noxious weeds like pigweed want to eat that potash and nitrogen. So it's just carpets of weeds. And the farmer has to use some manifested chemical to not kill their corn, but kill all of these weeds. They have to buy nitrogen because they no longer have any crop rotation and they can grow it in their own form. They don't have any livestock, so they don't have any manure. So it's like when COVID happened, it was great if you ate Cheetos, you were 100 pounds overweight, you were going to go to the hospital, get on a respirator, and cha-ching, money. But they weren't getting the guy that could do 100 push-ups that was, healthy, because he's fine. He has his own microbiome going on. So why I mentioned the marketing degree is I look at plants the same way that marketers look at the general population. And when I plant wheat in strips at 1/8 the seeding population, I know that the plant will perceive it like I'm selling water to someone that is thirsty, much differently than some guy that's drowning. But the industry wants everyone to stay drowning and be dependent. And if you think holistically and think through more of curves, you know that plants will adapt and perceive their environment. And now that we can use different plants, we can start layering the photosynthesis. I know that when the plants...
Let me stop because I want to try and make sure people are keeping up. Yes. So in a traditional farm, people go and they put a 24 row planter. They take the tractor down and they plant rows of corn all the way down, and then they turn around right next to it. They plant rows of corn all the way down. And we do that too. We've got a 36 row planter. 36 rows. So, yes. But you have started to, I think there were other people doing it even before you, but you pioneered in the relay cropping system, which is to say, in between, instead of planting the rows of corn just 16 inches apart, we're going to plant them even further apart, but in between those rows, we're going to plant things that can now have a synergistic relationship with our corn. So it's wheat in between your corn. What's going on in between your corn?
I don't do a lot with corn per se. Now, Zach Smith, the stock cropper, is intergrazing, which is instead of putting another cash crop in there, he's putting animals and they're moving and eating pasture to prime the nutrients for the next year's corn crop. So that's kind of its own rotation and diversity. What I do primarily is we plant wheat because our soybeans, when we were talking about pattern tile, they really like their feet to be dry, especially in the early part of their life cycle. So it's very hard to avoid heavy rain in the spring, so the beans don't grow very well. They turn yellow. So I had a lot of pain when my dad died. And in my first crop, 2011, we had a just full-out monsoon. We had like 15 inches of rain in the month of April, and then May was wet, and I kept trying to plant in the mud. Our crops were terrible. The next year was a drought. 13 was wet, 14 was wet, 15 was epic wet, like 50 inches of rain. So I experienced a bunch of pain from either too much rain or too little rain. So I looked at wheat as a landscaper as a way that I could control canopy. My grandpa farming saw weeds or wheat or anything other than what he wanted to grow as a threat. Where when I was a landscaper and I do a design, I have 20 plants. I thought about their shapes and sizes when they bloom and all this stuff. So I started experimenting with wheat and soybeans because they came out with a soybean that you could spray herbicide, the same herbicide that I would use on grass. So the weed control was very easy. I was familiar with canopy. But what I learned after a couple years of experimenting with wheat and soybeans was every plant, and I knew that from being a landscaper and growing up, getting seeds, the plants had minds. But I didn't really understand. It wasn't 150% mind. It was 1,500% of a mind. So I would do experiments like I dug a corn plant out when my kids were little, and we made a corn plant, put 31 ears on it. Because that plant, it's fractal in nature, and each leaf has the opportunity to either put it in a field with 40 other thousand plants, and it has to grow really high to just get a glimpse of sunshine in the field. Or if you put it out on its own, all 28 leaves can accept light. And the more light that it perceives early, it says, I can support another plant. So it'll have a thing called a tiller come out. So an identical plant comes out. So you might have two, and every plant comes out. And then if the ear comes out and it can perceive light, then leaves grow on the ear. So it's this mathematics of like Warren Buffett, he's got gazillions of dollars because he had $50,000 when he was 16 and he continued to invest it. That's the way plants work. So when we're in a one crop annual thing, the flywheel, the industry all works on just minions. They want a lot of plants out there, all dependent on industry to feed it. Where if you can have something like wheat and only put nitrogen underneath the wheat and allow each plant that comes up to perceive light, then it will grow in the shape of phi. The Fibonacci, everything is designed, our fingers, knees, and toes, our weather systems, everything is designed not linearly, but in the shape of phi. So the plants grow outward like a daylily bush. That shape in itself is not rectangular. If it was a rectangular and I had light, the edges would block the light. But since it's round and I split them out just wide enough, now the light isn't intercepted by the wheat. It can get down to the soybean. And what I figured out is I can only have so much yield or drawdown of the water to when it starts affecting variable B. So I started jacking with spacing, how fat this is, density, distance between the soybean and the wheat, to where I found a relationship where if I was about 9 inches off the wheat, then if I got a shit ton of rain, it was kind of the gills for the soybeans to breathe. And if I have a plant here with a life cycle that starts in the fall, grows a lot in March, April, and May, then it has no competition with this other crop because it grows in June, July, and August. So you can have different life cycles. And there's nothing against the whole regenerative farm movement whatsoever, but if I have a lot of cover crops out, I've got to kill the cover crop. So I've got to get Roundup, and that's another expense. I'm planting a crop that has zero revenue. I have to kill the crop, and then I have to delay my cash crop. And then the cover crop may be great if it rains a bunch this year, but if it rains below normal, then my cover crop drank all my water, so now my cash crop goes down. And that's just the reality of the situation. So if we can look at it like a marketer and say, we're going to look at the slope curve of this crop. And instead of doing exactly like Wheat Pete or Phil Needham, these wheat gurus that want you to plant this many seeds and have a perfect linear sun capture, and then it dies. And then we might go out and plant beans in July, then they might make like 30% what regular beans is, but it takes 5 times as much seed. We're going to take the slope curve of this crop. We're going to let each plant yield a maximum amount, but I'm not going to write as much of a check for my nitrogen or my seed. And now I can start using proxy. I know that there's no way that weeds will grow in this space. So why would I spray herbicide on the whole field when I could just spray herbicide on 30% of the field? And it's just the beginning. It's the easiest thing that there is. But things like that help inspire people like Zach Smith, who had a similar mind as myself and his friends, to do things like intergrazing. And that's where we need to go, is to tune in to the minds of the plants themselves and layer things, whether we're grazing or we're just in time applying manure, and get out of this one thing. Why don't you just do this and be done with it? Because you're competing. Well, and everything's competing.
It's interesting. Like I can tell your enthusiasm. Your audio levels are off the charts here. This is great. But one of the reasons that people plant all corn is it's really valuable, right? And like it's a little bit like the parents that say, I'm going to get my kid in basketball camp, and then he's going to get done. He's going to do regular basketball, and then he's going to do traveling basketball, and then we're going to do more basketball camps.
Yeah.
Because we want that kid to be hyper specific in basketball. And for a kid that is doing a bunch of different sports, none of them all that hardcore, it's very difficult for that kid to keep up, right? That one, if you just put this kid in all basketball for his whole career, like it's easier to raise a kid like that than it is to give a kid some experience with track, some with hockey, some with basketball, and still give him the skills to be a successful athlete, to be able to be an income earning athlete, because instead of being a specialist, he was a Renaissance man. Do you think, a farm is going to be able to grow and be profitable by doing this sort of Renaissance thing?
It won't be profitable the other way around, unless your grandpa has a shit ton of equity, which I'm fortunate to have. We own a lot of ground, so we can make money. If I was a new farmer right now, and I was the best corn farmer known to man, but I put the same amount of nitrogen, same amount of seeds, that whole farming cash rent is a break-even profit proposition at best. And you have to back up to grandpa's equity or some kind of manure that you can feed, something. Or the market is always going to fluctuate.
Yeah, and like we talked, if you're in a commodity, it's going to bring you all the way down to making as little money as possible.
So the idea that if my kid doesn't play travel ball and all this and does nothing but that one sport, maybe he can be in the NBA one day. That's how the industry works, is guys like Dave Hula. I love Dave Hula. Nice guy. Really good. But it's the dream that this 1 year that we put corn out, it's going to rain 1/4 inch every 2 days, and we're going to raise 450 bushel corn, and maybe them guys in Nebraska will burn up and corn will go up $1, and we're going to make all this money. That's the carrot, and that's because we're so indoctrinated in what we do, and we have such a hard on when we buy this new John Deere equipment that can go another mile an hour faster. It's 10 foot wider. I'm up here. It's cool, but we're not getting anywhere.
This is the first time in all the years I've known you, I've ever heard you make this pitch for, hey, young guy, if you want to figure out how to play in this game, this is the roadmap for you to use your mind to make your crops better, as opposed to trying to play the margin game better. Because the margin game, the strategy that they're being taught is go be a better neighbor to all your neighbors so that maybe he'll lease your ground to you instead of somebody else. But I've never heard, maybe you've been saying it and I just wasn't listening, but this is very appealing to me because I know a lot of people that want to get into farming, and the idea of like, hey, if you could be the guy that figures out in this area, what's the sun doing? What's its, how's it tracking across the field? What crops can we plant here? And if you can come up with a better way, now you're able to create margin on those two crops in a way that you'll never be able to do if you were doing the traditional corn, soy.
It's in the elimination.
Okay.
It's in eliminating so much of this, and this, and still arriving at a similar revenue standpoint. That's everything.
So you and I, a few years ago when we were first talking, these concepts of light and curves meant nothing to me. But I have since become obsessed with planting trees. And the crazy thing about planting trees is you get to watch in slow motion what's going on. Like, I didn't realize that a tree trunk will twist in order to be able to expose the branches, and it will do all kinds of things. But
137 degree angles, the golden angle.
Tell me more.
Yeah, all your trees, if you don't know where you are, the Boy Scout says find the moss, that's the north side. You can also find the Fibonacci because it's going to strive towards the south side. If you cut it down, it's going to fall on that side.
One of the cool things that Kate Crosby has taught me is that for the most part, plants really only grow when they're being exposed to the infrared side of the light spectrum, which is the much slower part of it. And that as the sun becomes more direct, as it tracks, higher and higher in the sky, most plants actually have to put on defense mechanisms and shut down. They aren't producing. You think like, oh, it's the middle of, it's noon and July 15th. That corn plant has just absolutely got to love that it's getting beaten down with sun. But the reality is it's growing mostly in the early morning hours, and then it gets some growth in the afternoon. That changed the way I thought.
So that's one thing you notice as a landscaper when you're trimming the bushes, all your light green stuff is happening up until, July in that more favorable growing condition. But to your point there, that's the mindset that we got to have with polycropping. I met a man named James Bates, and he was a plant breeder in Hawaii, and he was noticing the same thing, that plants get defensive in the heat of the summer and the heat of the afternoon. So he started putting up different ways to block the sun, and he noticed that the crops wouldn't wilt as bad in the hours of 2 to 6. And he also understood the plasticity of plants. So what he started doing was planting little groups of corn that would do what I talked about earlier. They would perceive the extra light, have multiple ears, milk the elasticity of the curve, and use them to block the sun's direct sunlight. As the sun changes positions through the day, the shadow changes on the ground floor, so you could have an understory of another crop that could provide nitrogen to the corn. You could milk the curve on this side and have a complementary relationship with the corn and the beans or whatever it is.
Well, and this is the craziest thing I've ever seen when I was shocked into understanding what you are talking about is when I went to see Zach Smith's field day. And so, like you were already describing, he plants rows of corn, and then in between he's got pasture, and then in that pasture he runs this thing called the stock cropper, where he's got goats in the front, then pigs, and then sheep and chickens in the back, and it just moves throughout the day. So the goats eat the first thing, that pigs eat next, and then it's right in between these rows of corn. But when you go look at the rows of corn, the ones on the outside are significantly taller than the ones on the, well, I mean, whatever your perspective.
The ones at the center are competing for light, so they're going to grow up high. The ones on the ends are pacified. So they're going to grow outward to collect light. So
You watch this arch.
So it doesn't matter if it's 2 rows, 4 rows, 8 rows, it's going to create an arch. And the more narrow or less rows of corn, the more steep the elasticity or plant yield of the corn will be. So I can raise 500 bushel corn if it's only an outside row, because all of the leaves that come out are plugged into the wall, if you will. So it's more energy. It's like taking a Chevy Chevette that weighs 1,000 pounds that you have a little rice burning 3-cylinder engine in and putting a V8 in there, and it'll go 0 to 60 like that. I go, what the hell's in this Chevette? Same thing with plants.
What's your vision on this? Like, if this caught fire, if people were like, all right,
it's just a matter of time.
You think it's a matter of time?
Yeah, the problem is our shit is so big. We have X9s. We have such a hard-on about horsepower, and it is fun. But you're trying to grow plants, so you don't need something that weighs 100,000 pounds to get across things. The problem is no one lives in rural America anymore. There's no labor. So you have to be this amazing person that can farm 5,000 acres by yourself. It's just the reality of the situation. But what is coming to agriculture?
Robotics
and automation. Yeah. So if I have that, that's where we need to revise things. If now this is an option, it is, again, not very smart or a good use of technology to have a robot pull a field cultivator. That robot could be harvesting one crop that's different than this. To try to figure out how to do big is difficult, because now I have to raise it up high or change the rows or something like that. Small makes everything easier to pull off.
That's wild to imagine, and a totally innovative idea.
That's what I'm waiting on. I'm just getting the interest and the science down to a path, knowing that is a reality of what's to come.
It's wild for me to think about that. You would be able to have this diversity of crops because you have robotics, and because you'd be able to analyze the field and say, these two crops could go well together, and there's a market not too far from here. I mean, one of the biggest challenges with doing what you're talking about is right now, if you harvest corn or soybeans, there are grain elevators to take those.
Right.
If you start harvesting sunflower seeds, where are you going to take them? Right. Where are you going to take?
But there's no reason why you can't grow what they do, just in a different arrangement of venue to get the maximum amount of the inputs.
Say that in another way.
There's no reason why you can't take the elevators that want corn and beans and wheat and grow them in a different arrangement to be much more efficient by using proxy to eliminate inputs and maximize plant yield and lower the amount of energy needed, because you're arranging it in time sequences for things to die and dry, consume water, become a wick when they die, the next crop's roots to live in a corpse, to block the wind. Like, you can do linear math, absolute, but nothing is absolute. There's two sides of the coin. I know that my wheat, you're getting a thunderstorm right now. I know that if I have wheat and I have a side slope in the hill, if I have a clean tillage field where nothing is growing, or even if it's no-till, it might absorb the first 5 minutes of a thunderstorm, but after that, where's the water going?
Just right over the top.
To the
lowest possible.
To the low point, which you need tile.
Yeah.
Right? What if I had something that had grown in the fall, is now hip high, and is going to physically stop and absorb that water? Am I going to make the side of the hill have more water in it in the summertime? Because you might have got 50 inches of rain that year, but only 10 of it stayed on this part of the soil. And you had no photosynthesis going on 300 days of the year. Now, that might be a 100-day hybrid, but until it comes up, it might be this tall, but that leaf is a fuzz on an elephant's nuts later on. It ain't jack shit. And, they say knee high by the 4th of July. Knee high is when you actually have canopy in corn. So you are July 4th or June 15th.
Yeah, but at this point, July 4th is not when it's knee high. It's knee high May 15th, right?
No. That never happens.
Well, we're
like an anomaly this year, and it might be June 4th. It's still going to be June.
It's not July, though.
But the point is, it goes to senescence in September.
Okay.
So you're
I don't
only
even know
really
what senescence is.
photosynthesizing for like 70 days.
What is senescence?
Out of the 3-6, die, dead.
Okay.
You know, when things that we're both going to, and we see every day, we're like getting gray and the plant dies. So my point is you need multiple life sequences out there that you don't need to terminate. Why grow a cover crop to this high and have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 12-1? Have you ever put cotton candy in your mouth or a Cheeto? What happens?
Just disintegrates.
It's nothing. Yeah, you got roots down low. But if I can get a cereal out there to 80-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, now I have a steak. I have carbon. I changed the soil tilth and structure. I change on the landscape. All this rain doesn't go in the field tile or off into the river, so grandma's house doesn't get destroyed. When St. Louis, when Minneapolis gets a shit ton of rain and St. Louis is dry and you lose your house and it didn't even rain this much, why is that?
Because it all floods down.
Because it all floods. It doesn't get it. And people, we have all kinds of fears, whether it's climate change or obesity or COVID or whatever it is. Our water cycle is probably the most important thing that's not talked about. When I drive out west and I have to speak the next day, I'll go to a bar and I'll sit next to a farmer and I'll ask him, what's your water situation? And if he's in his 60s or 70s, he'll say, it was like me when I was 5. I could pee and hit that door handle. I had pressure out the wazoo. Now they're farming one field. They're leaving a field bare because they have 1/4 of the water pressure that they had 40 years ago. So if I don't have the water anymore and I don't have the plants to translocate and sweat and keep that water cycle up and it's bare, if I keep it fallow and I work it and it's hot and it's fallow, it's going to change the weather. When we go and cut rainforest down for soybeans to be in your wife's fancy bar or whatever, I don't know if that's bar, but my wife has fancy brands that she uses. These affect our weather. They affect the big cycle of water, and that is what's going to hurt us more than anything, is the heat, the water cycle, the urbanization. If we don't have a landscape that absorbs water, that has living plants in it, and this is like a kindergarten move to use the commodity crops that you can sell to an elevator in a different arrangement to just have more photosynthesis. We need perennials out there. We need all these different things. The problem is the industry has nothing to sell. If I can propagate a perennial, a rootstock, and grow things, and I can have mama cows and bulls, and I can share their semen and have, then I am doing a beautiful thing, but I am extinguishing an industry.
So one of the big challenges with making changes like, hey, I'm going to do polycropping, right? I'm going to put more than one crop on there, is that somebody like you said, your grandpa, who would say, nah, we want this thing to look like a carpet of wheat. We don't want there to be anything in between there.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? I mean, like, change is very difficult. Farmers now are farming way longer than they ever did before. So if you're the landowner at 60, you could probably keep farming at 80, 85. Yep. You're the one that gets to control those decisions. What are your thoughts on farm succession and change?
I mean, you get up and walk or run in the morning sometimes. What's the difference between you running and riding a bike? The only thing is you're 3 times more efficient with your movement. So you can still drive the tractors. You can still do all this. We're just going to redesign it with some thought and some proxy and some different mathematics so they can still do it.
I'm talking about mentality, right? Like, there's like an old political philosophy that's like basically the only way that you make, we talked before about nobody likes to change unless you hit rock bottom, right?
Right.
Well, if you're not hitting rock bottom, you don't want to change. You're successful doing what you're doing. Change isn't going to happen until those people die.
Right. Well, there is some boredom to it as well. It's pretty boring, but I guess I'm going back but the reason I went to it was pain. It's just shitty crops, and I have way too much pride. I want to have beautiful landscapes, and I want to be proactive on my design of that landscape. But that's what the beautiful thing about podcasts, I think you were talking about last time about the printing press and how that scaled learning. And think about what we're able to do now. You can listen to a podcast while you're plowing or doing something old, learning about that new thing. I can get on Twitter or X and show people exactly how it's done, journal every day of the process. We share interesting ideas, and we can really close that gap between something that's extremely intimidating and fearful that it won't work out to Johnny, Bill, Tim does it this way, exactly like this. I can call him whenever I want, and we can make this work. The excuses are getting shot by the day.
You recently lost your grandfather.
Yes.
What will change now that he's not making the decisions?
Well, the thing is he didn't really make the decisions. I lost to precursor. My dad passed. That's the reason I came back to the farm. So there was kind of a power struggle there, but he was almost 90 when he passed. So as I became interested and believer in things, I went by the idea that it's much easier to just do it and ask for forgiveness than permission. And that kind of creates your own resume to build some trust, even though...
Wait. So you were going out there being like, I'm going to sneak some wheat in between?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the best thing is when everyone goes to bed, because everything I can hop in, turn the key, and just do whatever the hell I want. That's the best part, is the corn will come up and they're like, what the hell were you drinking last night? You missed 2 rows out there. And you're like, you really think that just accidentally it's perfect 60-inch corn out here? But yeah, that's kind of how I roll, if you will.
Is that, you think, an effective strategy for a lot of people? Just go out there and not ask for permission, ask for forgiveness?
Because that thumb, my grandpa, he had the checkbook right here, and he used it. And, he would have different moods. Like, if I grew a lot of crops, the way that he wanted, I'm a relatively good farmer, timely, I don't sleep, I make sure everything is done exactly when I can. So he'd pat me on the back. And then when I do something weird, if you will, I'd be mad. But then if it works out this year and then next year, and you do that 6, 8, 9, 10 years in a row, eventually he shakes his head, but it's no longer, this won't work.
So a young person that's trying to elbow their way in and they want to get a start, what's the way that they get people to take these chances?
You just got to push it. You gotta have some confrontation. You just got to do it. I made a post on X 4 or 5 days ago. And I do respect elders, but there's a point to where they don't want to give up even the smallest portion of any control, because the old adage, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So the question is, if you don't give your son or grandson an inch, how is he ever going to learn if he doesn't make small mistakes? Wouldn't you rather control the fire of mistake now? Then how mean is it to just be in full control and pass? And do you want them to fail, or do you want them to fail small so we don't burn down all of California?
This is so common.
It's happening. It's everywhere.
So I go give talks on having better conversations with people, how to overcome like conflict in particular situations, like, the family farm where somebody's still making all the decisions, even though somebody else is putting all the labor in. And man, over and over and over again, you will hear, I'm not allowed to change anything. I've got to do it the exact way that it was done before. Do you think you will have the wherewithal to allow your sons to try things?
Yeah, I hope they're interested in farming. I don't know what that will look like when they get old enough. My youngest is pretty interested, but yes, definitely. And I am a big proponent of turning kids into entrepreneurs. It doesn't have to be farming. It can be just as simple as selling Girl Scout cookies. Or I had a sweet corn stand when I was 8, and I took that thing, in 3 or 4 years, I was saying, hey, instead of just planting behind the tool shed 3 acres, let's go plant over here and over here. And by the time I had my driver's license, we were hand picking 10 acres of sweet corn. We had like 6 different vendors. I had a hat. When Milk had their Got Milk campaign, I would go to Lowe's and get gallons of paint, and it was Got Corn. And the state police would always stop me and be like, you got to move that sign down at the intersection, but you would see signs everywhere. But you got to give these kids an opportunity to be an entrepreneur, because that feeling of fulfillment when you have an idea and you turn it into cash, and you go to the county fair and you can throw 7 baseballs at a beer bottle knowing that you got $1,000 under your mattress at home, you can't beat that.
Yeah, and some kids have it. Like my little 3-year-old daughter, who is a girly girl, like princess out the wazoo. One day I was dropping her mom off at the airport, so it's just me and her in the car, and she says, Dad, I really want some pink sparkle sunglasses. And I was like, oh, that's great. Well, your birthday's in August, so that's how many months away? And like we counted it off how many months away, and she was like, that's a long time. And I was like, there is another way. And she was like, what's that? And I'm like, well, you could, do some work around the house that's a little bit more than what you're expected to do by the family. And that little girl, like when we got back home, was like, what can I do? Let's go. What can I do? And now anytime she sees the fireplace with ashes in it, she's like, Dad, I got the bucket. And like, this is a 3-year-old, right? When a kid gets that itch, because the day she got her pink sparkle sunglasses, and the thing that she got that went right along with this, you'll appreciate this with 2 boys, is in our family, we're basically inside the family socialists or communists, because after you've had your toy for about 24 hours, it's everybody's toy, right? If you didn't put it away, but those sunglasses, if her sister has them, we take them away from her. Those are Violet's sunglasses because she earned them. And now she has realized, if I buy this with my own money, then I also get the law on my side. So turning kids into entrepreneurs is awesome.
So that kind of goes to saying like what rock my grandpa had to stand on. He done it this way. He bought the grain bins. He did the combine. He had the saying, my combine, my rules. So I went to the auction. I bought the cheapest, most piece of shit combine possible just to pull off my thing. And I had my own little section of the barnyard where I had a little planter and a little combine, a little cultivator to do all my weird shit however I wanted. Because, if the great thing, if you're going to set a rule, then if you do the same thing that they did, then they can't call you out on it.
I love it. I love it. And particularly if you're a parent, like there's nothing you want more than a kid that's doing their own thing, to be able buying their own equipment to do whatever. One thing I think that is really important, you've instilled this in me. I remember seeing your field day right around COVID, and then going up and seeing Zach Smith's, is getting to field days where there are people that are trying the edge of things. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not so much even like, what are you going to learn by you get to see all this cool stuff, because people should go around and say, hey, this is how you make it so the stock cropper can go in between the rows of corn. Or in your case, like, this is what relay cropping looks like. Zach's going to do his in August. I want to say like somewhere around the 20th. And I think people should definitely go to that. Are you going to put on another field day?
I think so. I don't have a date yet. I'd like to time it to where I harvest my wheat like live. I did that like 6 years ago before you came.
Yeah, because it's nuts to watch harvesting wheat right next to soybeans, right? Because you're like, how can you possibly get a combine in here? But I'd like to see that.
There's a traffic and you push it down.
And what about other field days that you think, if people can't make it to your one in Indiana or Zach's up in northern Iowa, where any other interesting field days out there? I'd go see whatever John Kemp was doing.
Oh, John Kemp is a genius.
Let's talk about John Kemp. How did you encounter that crazy Amish farmer?
I think the first time was I was speaking at No Till on the Plains, And he said, "Hey, Jason, come here and sit on the couch." And I didn't know it was John Kemp, because his voice and his content sounds like the wisest man ever. And he's younger than me by 7 years or so. And we just developed a relationship. I went over to his house, and he's earned a spot to where, he stepped down from being the CEO, and he's he still has the largest role, but he's able to read books every day, interact with people on his podcast. He's built a network, it's shared learning, and he's just demonstrated how much more efficient of a human being you can be when you give others the permission to be weird, to learn their own, and share and create that community. And, I've got on X and kind of made that, but man, he's just on a completely other level of his capability and knowledge. And going back to my talking earlier about thinking outside the box and more holistically, I mean, he's done the work with all these growers, and I'd love to have that, a meeting with him and some other people that I have interesting in other industries and think like he does.
Yeah, I mean, I proposed to him, and I think maybe we'll try and I want to do a more regular podcast with him, because the way that his mind works, I think in large part is because he doesn't have the decay that comes from being constantly stimulated by social media and all the things that I'm stimulated by. He reads all the time. I mean, his knowledge is just amazing.
He's got bees.
Does he?
Yeah, a lot of honey. His wife is I can't, but it's the, can't even think of the word, but it's the energy in the body, looking at medicine that way. And, he's so ahead of the curve.
I think that this is such an awesome time, and COVID, I think, had a really positive impact on this, where the spell was broken by the propaganda of, we know how to market this, way of life to you, so that so that it feels like this is the only option, or the best option, or the highest option. And COVID, people got to see like, oh, wait a second, the people that are selling me things, their interests and my interests are not aligned in the same way. And so you see people trying different forms of medicine. I've had an Eastern medicine guy on in a way that I probably would have scoffed at him before. And now I'm like, Max, I'm really interested in what you have to say. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is something that's really changing in our culture in a very deep way.
Yeah. And when you talk about like, what's the future of the meat company or anything like that, I think people are going to gravitate more and more. Now, I won't say that the general public, but I think the interest of a group to grow their own food, to garden, to kind of create their own sense of community, to kind of get away from the mainstream, I think that's going to continue to grow and grow and grow because of COVID. And there's a lot of these people that lived in the city. They might have made $500,000, but going through that, they had to stare at four walls. Their life was so awful with everything shut down. So they valued being next to the nice restaurant and COVID maybe forced them or gave them freedom and bandwidth to get the hell out of the city and listen to the birds and bees. And I'm like, man, this is awesome. And I think there's going to be this new kind of slug, more and more of people that want to be more connected.
And the people that are expecting this will happen fast are going to be disappointed. But the slow moving changes, I think, that are going to have real inertia when they get going. I mean, I know in my own hometown, they started their own school, like a religious group did. And that school is becoming huge, right? Because they started offering the things that the people in that community wanted. They wanted to have real welding classes, teach people how to drive trucks, teach people about plumbing. I know that for myself and my wife, we're looking around at our school options, and what we have right now for our kids is great. But, a couple of years from now, that school option isn't available to them. So what are we going to do? I am tempted to start my own school, right? And to figure out, because it wouldn't take that much, right? If you have, 4 families with 2 to 3 kids and they're already going to pay 10 grand to be able to send their kid to private school, well, you just pile that money all into one pile and you have one teacher and you bring back the one-room schoolhouse, but you do it using, all the access that teacher would have to new information and having parents. This allows you to do things that you couldn't do before. And so to me, the education system will likely start changing. And
it has to, Vance. I mean, talking about like revising the cropping stuff, like if both of my kids are very good with their smartphone. And if I gave them a phone in the back and they went to like a trivia, like they would win just with their device. So like, why are we still teaching these kids to just remember information that they can look up? What is the true skill that our kids need to have to be successful in the real world? Is it what's being taught in schools, or is it more the things that you work on, like the way to socialize with friends and peel the layers of onions and really get to know people and create community and have the skilled trade? The thing that bothers me the most with the youth, I do a lot of coaching besides the diet and just the general health, is the lack of just that old generational knowledge. Read a map. We're so dependent on our device where we don't think it kind of goes against what I just said, but we're so dependent on our device for everything that we don't know anything.
A couple of years ago, I challenged people listening to the podcast, a group of people I was with, like, just don't use your navigation on your phone for a month. And I thought that this was kind of unfair because I live in St. Louis, like I go to the same places all the time, but I realized like really fast, within a week, I was like, this is really fucking hard, because if I don't know exactly where that place is, I am so unused to pulling up a map. I don't understand how the streets are laid out as a grid. I don't know which, really east and west here. Like,
but that's the problem is once you force yourself to do that, then you start understanding the patterns. A lot of people don't realize that the interstate system is numerical. This way, when you go out in the country, it's 500 north, 500 west. It means it's 5 miles west of this. You get in a town, you get either numbers or letters, and you start recognizing pattern. If we don't have any pattern recognition.
And that's probably what the smartphones do, is that they keep you from seeing the larger picture, right? You can get the exact answer, but the context that answer sits within is very, very difficult to understand. It's like the difference between saying, well, I can look up any poem I want, but like, do you really know the poem? Like the time it takes, I think I only have maybe 2 poems memorized, but those 2 poems have probably played a larger role in my life than almost any other piece of literature I've ever read, and certainly more than any novel, poem that I'm going to read, because you've internalized it in some way, right? There's a pattern that gets embedded.
I think we're not being fair to our kids. There's a saying that if you want to be a good parent, just be a little bit negligible. Don't be the helicopter mom. I get a nervous wreck when we go boating because I know they can fall out and drown or get hit by the owner.
That's real.
But I don't care if they fall 5 feet and break their arm, like they'll live. So being a little negligent, don't help them, let them figure it out. But we are hurting our kids' future more than anything when we don't allow them to fall in love and have that visceral feeling of whether like earning that girlfriend or not. Or I just think all of these apps, the social medias of the world, I don't think these kids need social media until they're out of school.
Out of school? So you're saying like 18?
Yeah, I mean, it is weaponized. You see how these kids are killing themselves, or all this stuff when they're in school. That's going to be tough to do. But sex in itself is becoming so cheapened and used as a way to maybe like, I think I think we're down a really dangerous path right now because of how we're using technology for these kids.
Well,
I'm not allowing them to live, that.
I'm with you on that. We talked about the dietary restrictions. I think, and Yosha Bach talked about on my podcast a couple weeks ago about how the Christian cult, which is what it was when it first, began to grow, started as a result of people being lost as the Roman Empire went into decay, right? It was like, hey, this is not working for us anymore. What's going to work for us? Hey, well, let's synchronize our minds by having the same belief set, and this will allow us to have the same values and the same interests and work together. I mean, I'm already seeing it, right? You already see some people going and wanting to have this trad life, which is really LARPing on what you think the old ways were like. But I think there will be religious cults, and I don't mean that necessarily in a negative or positive way. I just mean groups of people that are completely devoted to the synchronization of their minds with other people's minds, and they don't think for themselves, because the chaos that is coming from you can have sex with anybody you want with no consequence, and all the transactional relationships that are built through social media, I think we will watch an explosion of religious cults, and these young guys, I don't maybe young women too, but the young guys that are feeling lost in this world, they're going to be given gurus that give them meaning, because the life right now in this social media high-tech world is meaningless.
Mm-hmm. You used two words there that I didn't recognize. There was a
LARPing?
LARPing, and what was the thing before that?
I'm not sure. LARPing is live action role playing. So this is where those people that are like, I'm a knight, and they run around and they're playing like a knight, and they talk like a knight. And there's a guy named Eric Weinstein that talks a lot about how our politicians are LARPing, right? They're dressing up like a leader would, and they're standing up at a podium like a leader would, and they're using their hand motions. But the reality is they were not leaders before they came there. It used to be, people don't understand this about our political system. In the United States, it used to be that the members of the House of Representatives were voted on by the electorate, the popular vote, right? But the senators were not. The senators were appointed by the state houses.
Okay.
So your state house would say, hey, we're going to go out and find somebody that's led something before. They have something they're giving up. Maybe they're a judge or an attorney or a banker or an accountant, but they are a farmer. We're going to take this guy, and as a state house, we're going to vote on it. So it's not going to be popular vote. It's going to be this representative vote, and we're going to send them away for 6 years to Washington, D.C. And the reason that it was 6 years is because that's how long they could go away from their business and then come back, and they'd send a new one. And this person was not treated to the whims of mob-like culture, right? Mm-hmm. So just by changing who we sent to the White House or to Congress as a senator, now you start having these senators that are voted on by popular vote. Well, so who they are and what they need to be to the mob, which is what direct democracy is the mob rule. Now you're electing people that look like leaders, but they never ran a business. They never built something. They aren't foundational key members of their community. They're lifetime politicians. And so we have a whole House of Representatives and a whole House of Senate that is just people pretending like they're leaders, but really all they are is politicians, which are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's probably the number one reason why ideas like mine or Zach's aren't mainstream. When Biden just continues to print money for these initiatives, it was already baked in. The trillions of dollars for this infrastructure bill all went to the industry themselves to just continue status quo and just change it slightly to pacify, the people. Because we're just saying what we already know, but because we've changed the way that they're elected, the whole reason why a politician gets into that is they have 10 friends with gourds of cash that said, if you get in, can change this, and this is yours. It's just how it works.
Well, man, we could talk all afternoon. This has been great. If people wanted to follow along with you and they wanted to know when your field day will be, they want to participate in the community, how should they go about tracking you?
So the best way, I'm most active on X. So it's Jason Mauck 1. That's MAUCK 1. You can track me on Facebook. But yeah, just look out for my field day probably in June, late June.
Oh, that's great. Really?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, let me know about that as soon as possible. I'll put it out there. So, all right, man. Thank you so much for coming on.